The late afternoon sunlight poured through the wide windows of the Bennett house, pooling on the polished hardwood floor. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost feels intrusive, like you shouldn't be there. My best friend Aaron had told me to let myself in. "I'll be back soon," he'd texted. "Luke's home if you need anything." Luke. I wasn't sure how I felt about being left alone with him. Aaron's older brother had always seemed different. He had this way of carrying himself, like he knew everyone was watching but didn't care enough to play into it. He was reserved but not shy, aloof but never rude. Around him, I felt clumsy, overly aware of myself in a way I couldn't quite explain. I pushed the thought aside as I slipped off my shoes and stepped into the living room. The space was warm and familiar, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of coffee and cedarwood. Aaron's absence was palpable, though. Without him, the house felt too big, like it might swallow me whole if I didn't keep moving. "Hey!" The voice came from behind me, low and unhurried, and I nearly jumped. I turned to find Luke standing in the doorway to the kitchen, a glass of water in his hand. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and black sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled like he'd just rolled out of bed. "Oh, hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Aaron said he'd be back soon." He nodded, taking a slow sip from his glass. "Yeah, he mentioned. You can hang out here if you want." "Thanks." I shifted awkwardly, unsure of what to do with myself. "I didn't mean to intrude or anything." "You're not?" He set the glass down on the counter and leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. His eyes, dark, unreadable, seemed to linger on me for a moment too long before he glanced away. "You hungry or anything?" "No, I'm good," I said quickly, though my stomach betrayed me with a faint grumble. Luke's mouth quirked into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "There's stuff in the kitchen if you change your mind." "Thanks." An awkward silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of unspoken things. I fiddled with the hem of my sleeve, wishing Aaron would hurry up. And yet, at the same time, I couldn't help but feel drawn to Luke's quiet presence, the way he seemed completely at ease in his own skin. "Do you want to sit down?" he asked suddenly, gesturing toward the couch. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my chest tighten. "Sure." I followed him into the living room where he sank into one corner of the couch. I took the other end, keeping a careful distance between us. He picked up the remote and turned on the TV, flipping aimlessly through channels until he settled on some crime show. The sound filled the room, breaking the silence but not the tension. Minutes passed, the show unfolding on the screen, but I couldn't focus. My attention kept drifting to Luke, to the way he leaned back against the cushions, one arm draped lazily over the back of the couch. He was close, closer than I realized, and I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him even across the small gap between us. "You okay?" he asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Yeah," I said quickly, though my voice sounded far too high. "Just tired." He glanced at me, his eyes sharp and assessing like he could see right through me. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and turned back to the TV. But his arm shifted slightly, brushing against mine for the briefest of moments, and I felt a jolt of something I wasn't ready to name, shoot through me. The brush of his arm against mine shouldn't have meant anything. It was an accident, a simple shift in position, but it lingered. The warmth of it, the unspoken acknowledgement of proximity. I sat stiffly for a moment, barely breathing, my gaze fixed on the TV screen as though sheer willpower could erase the weight of the silence pressing down on us. Luke didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was better at pretending than I was. He shifted again, this time leaning slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched the show. His hair fell across his forehead, and he raked a hand through it absently. "You're tense," he said after a while, his voice cutting through the noise of the TV. "What?" I turned toward him, startled. "You're sitting like someone just told you they were going to pull your teeth out," he said, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His tone was teasing, but there was a softness to it, a hint of something gentler beneath the surface. "Oh." I forced a laugh, leaning back against the couch in an attempt to look relaxed. "Just tired, I guess." Luke tilted his head slightly, studying me with those dark, unreadable eyes. It felt like he was peeling back layers, searching for something I wasn't ready to admit. "Aaron told me you've been working a lot lately." "Yeah," I said, grateful for the conversational out. "Classes have been insane. Plus, I've been helping my mom with stuff, so—" I shrugged. "Not much downtime." "Sounds rough." He leaned back again, his arm draping casually across the back of the couch, close enough that I could feel the faintest brush of his fingers against my shoulder. "You need to take a break sometimes, you know." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't tell if it was because of his words or the way he was looking at me, like he knew something I didn't. The TV droned on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention to it anymore. The air between us felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm, when the world seems to hold its breath. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. Then, without warning, Luke stood up. "You want something to drink?" he asked, his tone easy, as though the weight of the moment hadn't touched him at all. "Sure," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I sank back against the couch, exhaling a shaky breath. What the hell was I doing? This was Luke, Aaron's brother. I barely knew him, and yet there was something about him that made it impossible to look away, to ignore the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near. "Here." His voice startled me, and I looked up to find him standing in front of me, holding out a glass of water. "Thanks." I took it from him, my fingers brushing against his for the briefest of moments. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Luke sat down again, closer this time, his knee brushing against mine. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until it felt like I might drown in it. "You're quiet," he said after a while, his voice low. "So are you," I countered, my tone sharper than I intended. His mouth quirked into a small smile. "Fair enough." Another stretch of silence. I sipped my water, desperate for something to do with my hands, but the movement did nothing to ease the tension coiling in my chest. Luke watched me, his gaze steady and unflinching, and I felt like I was being drawn into a current I didn't know how to fight. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "you don't have to try so hard." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He leaned closer, his arm brushing against mine again, deliberate this time. "I mean, you don't have to pretend you're not nervous." My breath caught, and I felt a flush creeping up my neck. "I'm not—" "Don't lie," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay. I make people nervous sometimes." "I'm not nervous," I insisted, though the words came out weaker than I'd intended. He smiled then, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that made my chest tighten. "If you say so." The weight of his gaze was unbearable, and I turned away, my fingers tightening around the glass in my hands. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something, but I didn't know what, or if I was ready to fall. Luke didn't press me further. Instead, he shifted again, his arm brushing against mine one last time before he stood up. "I'm going to grab a blanket," he said, his tone light. "You look like you're about to freeze." I hadn't even noticed the chill creeping into the room, but as soon as he mentioned it, I realized I was shivering. I nodded mutely, grateful for the excuse to look away from him. When he returned, he draped the blanket over the back of the couch, then sat down beside me again, closer this time. The warmth of his body seeped through the thin fabric of my shirt, and I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, though the words felt hollow. For a while, we sat there in silence, the TV forgotten as the room filled with the quiet hum of our breathing. I felt his arm drape over the back of the couch again, closer this time, and I wondered if he could hear the way my heart was pounding in my chest. "You can relax, you know," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I am relaxed," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Luke turned to me then, his gaze steady and unflinching. "No, you're not." He shifted slightly, his arm brushing against mine as he leaned closer. The air between us felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and the intensity there made my breath catch. For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence between us heavy and unbroken. And then, slowly, deliberately, Luke leaned in. His movement was unhurried, almost cautious, as if giving me time to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My breath caught in my chest as Luke's face came closer, his eyes locked on mine, questioning and sure all at once. The air between us felt thin, almost non-existent, and I was hyper-aware of everything. The faint scent of his cologne, the warmth radiating from his skin, the way my heart hammered against my ribs like it might break free. Then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he wasn't sure if I'd let it happen. But I didn't stop him. My eyes fluttered shut, and I felt my body tilt slightly toward him, as though drawn by some invisible force I couldn't control. His hand found its way to my cheek, the calloused pads of his fingers brushing against my skin, and a shiver ran down my spine. I should have pulled back. I should have said something, done something to stop this before it went any further. But the truth was, I didn't want to. Not when his hand slid down to my neck, his thumb resting just below my jaw as he deepened the kiss. Not when the weight of the moment pressed down on us, heavy and intoxicating. It was Luke who broke the kiss first, pulling back just enough to look at me. His breathing was uneven, his lips slightly parted, and his eyes searched mine as though trying to decipher what I was thinking. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find my voice. My chest felt tight, like I'd forgotten how to breathe, and all I could do was stare at him, wondering how we'd ended up here, how something I'd barely allowed myself to imagine had become real. His hand lingered on my neck, warm and steady, as though anchoring me in place. "You can tell me to stop," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my skin in a way that made my pulse race. "I don't want you to stop," I said finally, my voice shaky but honest. A flicker of something crossed his face. Relief, maybe, or something deeper, and he leaned in again, his lips finding mine with a new urgency. This time there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, more deliberate now, more sure. I felt his other hand on my knee, his fingers curling slightly as though testing the waters. The weight of his touch sent a jolt through me, and I couldn't stop the soft sound that escaped my lips. He seemed to notice, his grip tightening just slightly, and I found myself leaning into him, wanting more. The blanket fell from my shoulders as I shifted, and Luke's hand moved from my knee to my thigh, his touch firm but not demanding. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. "This is Aaron's brother. What are you doing?" But they were drowned out by the sensation of his hand against my skin, the warmth of his body so close to mine. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, the room silent except for the faint hum of the TV in the background. Luke's forehead rested against mine, his hand still on my thigh, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles. "I've wanted to do that for a while," he admitted, his voice low and rough. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Me too," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, and for a moment, the intensity of the moment softened. But then his hand moved slightly, his fingers trailing higher up my thigh, and the tension snapped back into place, sharp and electric. "Is this okay?" he asked again, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. My hands found their way to his chest, my fingers curling slightly against the fabric of his shirt as I tried to ground myself. His heart was beating just as fast as mine, and the realization sent a rush of something warm and heady through me. Luke's gaze held mine for a long moment, and then his lips were on mine again, hungrier this time, more insistent. His hand moved higher, his fingers brushing against the bare skin just above my knee, and I felt my breath hitch. The world outside the room seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of us, tangled together in something we couldn't quite name but couldn't deny. "Luke," I whispered against his lips, the sound of his name foreign but right in my mouth. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Say that again," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Luke," I repeated, my voice steadier now. He exhaled sharply, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh, and pressed his forehead against mine. "You're going to drive me crazy," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I couldn't help but laugh softly, the sound breaking the tension just enough to make it feel less overwhelming. But the moment didn't last long. Luke's hand moved again, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate lines against my skin, and the laughter caught in my throat. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice serious now, his gaze steady. "No," I said quickly, the word escaping before I could second-guess it. He smiled again, softer this time, and leaned in to kiss me once more. His hand slid higher, his touch sending shivers through me, and I felt myself leaning into him, letting the moment carry me away. It was as though all the tension, all the unspoken words and stolen glances had built to this, a moment that felt inevitable, unstoppable. Luke's hands were everywhere now, on my thigh, my back, my neck, pulling me closer, anchoring me to him. I could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of my shirt, the steady rhythm of his breathing matching mine. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and I didn't want it to stop. When we finally broke apart again, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. Luke's hands were still on me, his touch warm and steady, and I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and fear. "What happens now?" I asked softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Luke's smile was faint but genuine, and he brushed a strand of hair from my face. "We figure it out," he said simply, "one step at a time." I nodded, my chest tight with something I couldn't quite name. "Okay." The words hung in the air between us, fragile but firm, like a tentative agreement neither of us dared to challenge. Luke's hand was still on my thigh, his thumb moving in slow, steady circles that sent ripples of warmth coursing through me. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away from him, his eyes still locked on mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the TV filled the silence, but it felt distant, like the world outside this room had faded into irrelevance. It was just us, our shared breaths, the charged air between us, and the weight of what we'd just done settling heavily around us. "Are you okay?" Luke asked finally, his voice low and steady. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. My heart was still racing and my skin buzzed with the ghost of his touch. "Yeah," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, small and fleeting, but it reached his eyes. "Good." His hand lingered for a moment longer before he finally pulled back, sitting up straighter and running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to. I didn't expect." He trailed off, letting out a soft laugh. "This wasn't exactly how I thought today was going to go." "Me neither," I admitted, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "But I don't regret it." His gaze snapped back to mine, sharp and searching. "You don't?" "No." The word came out steadier than I expected, and I felt my cheeks flush under his scrutiny. "Do you?" Luke shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No," he said simply. "Not even a little." The tension in my chest eased slightly at his words, and I felt a tentative smile of my own creeping onto my face. For the first time since this started, since he'd kissed me, since everything, I felt a flicker of something like certainty. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, it was real. And that was enough. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment like glass. My stomach dropped and I shot a glance toward the window where the familiar outline of Aaron's car was just coming into view. "Shit," I muttered under my breath, already scrambling to straighten my shirt and smooth down my hair. Luke didn't seem nearly as panicked as I was. He leaned back against the couch, his expression calm, though there was a glint of amusement in his eyes as he watched me flail. "Relax," he said, his voice tinged with laughter. "It's not like we're doing anything wrong." I shot him a look, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Are you kidding me? What do you think Aaron would say if he—" Before I could finish, the front door swung open and Aaron's voice called out from the hallway. "Hey, I'm back." I froze, my body going rigid as my heart threatened to beat out of my chest. Luke, on the other hand, remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable as he turned his attention back to the TV. "Living room," he called back, his tone easy as though nothing at all had happened. Aaron appeared in the doorway a moment later, his keys jangling in his hand. "You guys been hanging out?" he asked, glancing between us as he shrugged off his jacket. "Yeah," Luke said casually, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Just watching TV." Aaron raised an eyebrow at me and I forced a smile, praying he couldn't see the flush still lingering on my cheeks. "Yeah," I echoed weakly. "Just hanging out." Aaron didn't seem to notice anything amiss. He flopped down into the armchair across from us, his attention already drifting to the TV. "Cool. Sorry I took so long. Got caught up at work." "No worries," Luke said, his tone calm, though I could feel the faintest brush of his knee against mine, a subtle, deliberate reminder of what had just happened. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the conversation, on Aaron's stories about work and school, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Luke, his touch, his words, the way his lips had felt against mine. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at me out of the corner of my eye, his expression calm but his gaze burning with something I couldn't quite name. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and reluctance. Aaron walked me to the door, chatting casually about our plans for the weekend, but my attention was elsewhere. On the faint sound of Luke's footsteps lingering in the hallway, on the way my chest tightened as I glanced back one last time to find him watching me from the shadows. "See you later," Aaron said with a grin, clapping me on the shoulder before retreating back into the house. "Yeah," I said softly, my gaze lingering on the doorway even after it had closed. "See you." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he'd looked at me, the way his hand had felt on my skin. I replayed our conversation over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every glance, every touch. What did it mean? What was I supposed to do now? I didn't have any answers, but the questions haunted me, following me into my dreams and lingering in the corners of my thoughts the next day. I found myself glancing at my phone more often than I wanted to admit, half hoping for a message from Luke, half dreading what it might say if it came. It didn't. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was a mess of nerves and anticipation. Aaron had invited me over again, and I didn't know what I was walking into. If Luke would even be there, if he'd say anything, if things would feel the same. When I arrived, it was Aaron who opened the door, his smile as easy and unbothered as ever. "Hey man, come in. Luke's around here somewhere." My heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name, but I forced myself to play it cool. following Aaron into the house like nothing was out of the ordinary. And then I saw him. Luke was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in his hand. His eyes met mine as soon as I walked in, and for a split second, everything else faded away. The weight of his gaze was as heavy as ever, and I felt that same electric pull, sharp and undeniable. "Hey," he said, his voice low and even. "Hey," I managed, my throat suddenly dry. Aaron didn't seem to notice the tension crackling between us. He grabbed a bag of chips from the counter and tossed them onto the kitchen table. "We're going to watch the game," he said, already turning toward the living room. "You guys coming?" Luke's eyes never left mine. "Yeah," he said after a moment, his tone calm. "We'll be right there." Aaron disappeared into the next room, leaving the two of us alone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with all the things we weren't saying, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, waiting to see if he'd push me over. "Are we okay?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke's lips curved into a faint smile, and he took a step closer, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Yeah," he said softly. "We're okay."